independence of all nations from foreign rule. Between WW1 and WW2. Euro-BW Wars, Germany was proclaimed a republic, which didn't satisfy some revolutionaries. Socialist leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were assassinated. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, there were revolutions in many other countries of Europe such as Hungary, Finland, and Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, which had earlier been parts of the Russian Empire. All these revolutions were short-lived. The political situation in almost every country in Europe was complicated. This period saw the growth of socialist and communist parties in almost every country of Europe. However, within a few years in many countries of Europe, the socialist movements were defeated and dictatorial governments came to power. Fascism in Italy. Number of political movements which arose in Europe after the WW1 are generally given the name fascist. Common features of these movements were their hostility to democracy and socialism, and the aim of establishing dictatorships. Succeeded in many countries of Europe, such as Hungary, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Germany, Spain. Fascism movement started in Italy under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had organized armed gangs against socialists and communists in 1919. He had joined WW1 with the aim of gaining colonies. However, the peace treaties had failed to satisfy its ambitions. The Italian government at the time was dominated by capitalists and landlords who began to support anti-democratic movements which promised to save them from the danger of socialism as well as to satisfy their colonial aspirations. The movement started by Mussolini was one such movement. Armed gangs were used by landlords and industrialists to organize violence against socialists and communists. A systematic campaign of terrorism and murder was launched, but the government showed little interest in curbing it. In 1921, elections were held in Italy. Socialists and communists won 138 seats and Mussolini's party could get only 38. However, he marched on Rome in 1922 and seized power without firing a shot. The victory of fascism in Italy was neither the result of a victory in elections nor of a popular uprising. The government of Italy was handed over to the fascists because the ruling classes of Italy considered democracy and socialism as threats to their power. The takeover of the government by fascists was followed by a reign of terror. The socialist and communist movement was suppressed. In 1926, all political parties except Mussolini's party were banned. Fascists believed that there could be no harmony between two or more nations. They glorified war which, according to them, ennobled people. They advocated a policy of expansion and said that nations which do not expand cannot survive for long. Fascism in Germany. Germany had sought to satisfy her imperial ambitions through WW1 but suffered defeat. The outbreak of revolution in Germany towards the end of the WW1 led to the collapse of the German monarchy. However, even though Germany became a republic, the forces behind the monarchy, the industrialists, the big landowners, and the officers of the army remained quite powerful. The government was not able to destroy their power. These forces began to turn to the anti-democratic forces represented by Nazism to extend their power and to check the power of the socialist movement. Karl Hitler too tried to capture power through a march on Berlin, but was captured and jailed. The Hall Putsch of Munich in November 1923 gave Hitler recognition worldwide, time to write in jail where he wrote Mein Kampf and moved him to change tactics of Nazi party to capture power through legitimate means. Mein Kampf, he expressed some of the most monstrous ideas of the Nazi movement. Glorified the use of force and brutality, and the rule by a great leader, and ridiculed internationalism, peace and democracy. Preached extreme hatred against the German Jews who were blamed not only for the defeat of Germany in WW1 but for all the ills of Germany. Glorified violent nationalism and extolled war. These ideas of the Nazis found favor with the army, the industrialists, the big landowners, and the anti-republican politicians. Began to look upon Hitler as the savior of Germany. Nazis capitalized on the sense of humiliation which many Germans felt at their defeat in the war and the unjust provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Also exploited the misery of the people which had worsened due to the reparations which Germany was made to pay to the Allied powers. 1929 occurred the most serious economic crisis which affected all the capitalist countries of the world. As a result of this crisis, 8 million workers, about half of the working population of Germany, were rendered unemployed. It was during this period that the Nazi Party, which was no more than a conspiratorial group in the beginning, began to spread its influence. The Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party were powerful parties with huge following, however, failed to unite against the Nazis. The elections held in Germany before Hitler came to power, Nazi Party had polled less votes than the Socialist and Communist vote put together. Had won only 196 seats out of a total of about 650. Hitler's coming to power was the result of political intrigues. In spite of his poor showing in the elections, Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany by the President of Germany in January 1933. Soon after coming to power, Hitler ordered fresh elections and let loose a reign of terror. Assassination of anti-Nazi leaders was organized on a large scale. February 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire by the Nazis. Communist Party Germany was blamed for the fire and was suppressed. In spite of the terror organized by the Nazis, the Nazi Party could not win a majority of seats in parliament. However, Hitler assumed dictatorial powers, enabling act, and, in 1934, became the president. Trade unions were suppressed and thousands of socialists, communists, and anti-Nazi political leaders were exterminated. Nazis started huge bonfires into which the works of some of the best writers of Germany and other countries were thrown. Besides socialists and communists, Jews were made victims of an organized campaign of humiliation and violence. USA. One of the most important features of the period after WW1 was the decline in the supremacy of Europe in the world and the growing importance of the United States of America. Emerged as the richest and the most powerful country in the world at the end of the war. This was clear from the important role that she played during the framing of the peace treaties. It made tremendous industrial progress and was beginning to make heavy investments in Europe. However, in spite of this progress, the USA was frequently beset with serious economic problems. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939 and was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. Began after the stock market crash of 29 October 1929, Black Tuesday, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors and 9,000 banks. Since banks were uninsured, people lost all their life savings. The banks that survived weren't willing to extend loans, leading to downturn in investment. Roaring 20s throughout the 1920s as the US economy expanded rapidly, and the nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. New York Stock Exchange was scene of reckless speculation, where everyone from millionaire tycoons to cooks and janitors poured their savings into stocks. As a result, the stock market underwent rapid expansion, reaching its peak in August 1929. By then, production had already declined and unemployment had risen, leaving stock prices much higher than their actual value. Additionally, wages at that time were low, consumer debt was increasing, the agricultural sector of the economy was struggling due to drought and falling food prices, and banks had an excess of large loans that could not be liquidated. The American economy entered a mild recession during the summer of 1929, as consumer spending slowed and unsold goods began to pile up, which in turn slowed factory production. Nonetheless, stock prices continued to rise, and by the fall of that year, had reached stratospheric levels that could not be justified by expected future earnings. As consumer confidence vanished in the wake of the stock market crash, the downturn in spending and investment led factories and other businesses to slow down production and begin firing their workers. Those who were lucky enough to remain employed, wages fell and buying power decreased. Many Americans forced to buy on credit fell into debt, and the number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. Global adherence to the gold standard, which joined countries around the world in a fixed currency exchange, helped spread economic woes from USA to throughout the world, especially Europe. Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had dropped by half. Headlines, soup kitchens and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common in America's towns and cities. Previous depressions, farmers were usually safe from the severe effects of a depression because they could at least feed themselves. Fortunately, during the Great Depression, the Great Plains were hit hard with both a drought and horrendous dust storms, creating what became known as the Dust Bowl. The dust storms damaged the crops. Not only could the small farmer not feed himself and his family, he could not pay back his debt taken for cropping. Banks would then foreclose on the small farms, and the farmer's family would be both homeless and unemployed. The US economy broke down and entered the Great Depression during the presidency of Herbert Hoover. Although President Hoover repeatedly spoke of optimism, the people blamed him for the Great Depression. As soon as Roosevelt took office, he closed all the banks and only let them reopen once they were stabilized. Next, Roosevelt began to establish programs that became known as the New Deal. A major turnaround for the US economy occurred after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entrance of the United States into World War II. Once the US was involved in the war, both people and industry became essential to the war effort. Weapons, artillery, ships, and airplanes were needed quickly. Men were trained to become soldiers, and the women were kept on the home front to keep the factories going. Emergence of Soviet Union period after WW1 saw emergence of the Soviet Union as a major power, and she began to play a crucial role in world affairs. Military intervention by Britain, France, USA and Japan in Russia in support of the counter-revolutionary forces has already been mentioned. In 1920 the counter-revolutionary forces had been defeated and the foreign armies driven out. The period of civil war was of acute economic distress for people. In 1921, the new economic policy was introduced. Under this policy, the peasants were allowed to sell their produce in the open markets, payment of wages in cash was reintroduced, and production of goods and their sale in some industries under private control was permitted. Few years later, in 1929, the USSR started its vigorous program of economic reconstruction and industrialization when it adopted the first of a series of its 5-year plans. Within a few years, the Soviet Union emerged as a major industrial power. Extraordinary economic progress that the Soviet Union achieved was against heavy odds. The foreign intervention had been ended. Many countries of Europe and the United States followed a policy of economic boycott with the aim of destroying the revolution. However, the Soviet Union not only survived, but continued to grow economically at a fast rate. The only country which remained unaffected by the economic crisis of 1929 to 33. On the contrary, its industrial development went on as before while millions of people in West were unemployed and thousands of factories had come to a standstill. The Soviets adopted the policy of promoting collective farms. These farms, individual ownership of farms by peasants was ended, and the peasants worked on these collective farms collectively. The government pursued the policy of collectivization vigorously, and by 1937 almost all cultivable land was brought under collective farms. Initially, the peasants were free to decide whether they wanted to join the collective farms or not. Later, they were forced to join. Rich peasants who opposed collectivization were severely dealt with. The process of collectivization of agriculture was accompanied by many atrocities. According to some estimates, millions of people perished in this period. After the death of Lenin in 1924, many serious differences arose within the ruling Communist Party, the only political party which existed, over policies to be followed. There was also serious struggle for power between different groups and individual leaders. In this struggle, Stalin emerged victorious. In 1927, Trotsky, who had played an important role in the revolution and had organized the Red Army, was expelled from the Communist Party. In 1929, he was sent into exile. 1930s, almost all the leaders who had played an important role in the revolution and in the following years were eliminated. False charges were brought against them, and after fake trials they were executed. Political democracy and freedom of speech and press were destroyed. Expression of differences even within the party was not tolerated. Stalin, who had been the General Secretary of the Communist Party, assumed dictatorial powers, which he exercised till his death in 1953. These developments had an adverse effect on the building of socialism in the USSR and introduced features which were contrary to the humanistic ideals of Marxism and of the revolution. Development of art and literature also suffered because of restrictions on freedom. The Soviet Union was not recognized by most European powers and USA for a long time. However, with its growing strength she could not be ignored, and gradually one country after another recognized her. Britain established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in 1933. In 1934 she also became a member of the League of Nations. However, in spite of the ending of the isolation of the Soviet Union, the hostility towards the Soviet Union continued. The Soviet Union followed a policy of support to the movements for independence. Help given to China is notable in this context. The fascist countries started their acts of aggression, the Soviet government pressed for action against them. However, the Western countries did not agree to the Soviet proposals. Continued to regard the Soviet Union as a danger to them and hoped that fascist countries would destroy her. Hostility to the Soviet Union led to the appeasement of fascist powers and paved the way for the Second World War. The nationalist movement in Turkey was organized to prevent the domination of the country by the Allied powers and the annexation of parts of Turkey by Greece and Italy. Sultan of Turkey agreed to the terms dictated by the Allied powers. However, even before the treaty was signed by the Sultan, a national government had been established under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal with its headquarters at Ankara. This government signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet government in 1921, under which Turkey received Soviet political support and arms for the nationalist cause. Following the treaty with the Sultan, Turkey had been invaded by Greece. Turks under Kemal's leadership were able to repel the invasion, and the Allies were forced to repudiate the earlier treaty. Allied troops were withdrawn from Turkish territory, and the areas which were to be annexed by European countries remained in Turkey. Turkey was able to win her complete independence. Success of the Turks in winning the complete independence of their country was followed by a program to modernize Turkey and to end the influence of backward-looking feudal elements. Turkey was proclaimed a republic. In 1911, there was a revolution in China which resulted in the establishment of a republic. However, power passed into the hands of corrupt warlords, Beiyang army factions. National movement in China aimed at the overthrow of foreign domination and the unification of China by ending the rule of the warlords. Founder of the national movement in China was Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He had played an important role in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, which overthrew the Qing dynasty, and in 1917 had set up a government at Canton in South China. Party formed by him called Kuomintang led the national struggle in China for a number of years. The government in Russia had renounced all the unequal treaties which the Russian emperors had imposed on China and had promised full support to the Chinese national struggle. In 1921, the Communist Party of China was formed. In 1924, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party decided to work together, and the Soviet government gave various kinds of aid, such as the training of a revolutionary army. A number of Soviet political and military advisors worked with the Chinese liberation movement. After the death of Sun Yat-sen in 1925, the unity between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party was broken and a period of civil war began. In the 1930s, when the Japanese attacked China with the aim of subjugating the entire country, the two parties agreed to work together to resist the Japanese invasion. The Communist Party played a leading role in the war of resistance against the Japanese invasion. It was able to establish its supremacy in the country, and within a few years after the end of the WW2 was victorious in the Civil War. Africa. Though the struggles for national independence in Africa gained momentum after WW2, the 1920s and the 1930s were a period when the first political associations were formed. An important role in the growth of national consciousness in Africa was played by a series of Pan-African congresses. The African movement asserted the identity and unity of the African people and independence of Africa. The national movement in South Africa had emerged earlier than in other parts of Africa. In 1912, the African National Congress had been formed, which became the leading organization of the South African people. Ethiopia fought heroically against the Italian invasion 1935–36, and their resistance served as a source of inspiration to the people of Africa. Beginning of aggression in the 1930s, the fascist powers began their wars of conquest, which ultimately led to the WW2. Major fascist countries were Italy and Germany, who got an ally in the militarist regime which came to power in Japan. These three countries started series of aggressions in Europe, Asia and Africa. All of them claimed to have been fighting against communism and were united in 1937 under the Anti-Comintern Pact. The acts of aggression began. The aggrieved countries, the Soviet Union and many leaders in different countries demanded collective action to defeat the aggressions. 1935, the Communist International advocated the formation of popular fronts consisting of communists, socialists and other anti-fascists to counter the danger of fascism and war. Hitler had come to power in Germany because the Communist and Social Democratic parties of Germany had failed to unite against the Nazis. Comintern's advocacy of uniting all anti-fascist forces was followed by the formation of popular fronts in many countries. France, the Popular Front succeeded in preventing a fascist takeover. The Covenant of the League of Nations contained a provision for economic and military sanctions and collective action against aggression. However, the Western governments, instead of resisting the aggressions, followed a policy of appeasement of the aggressive powers. Since the success of the Russian Revolution, the Western countries had been haunted by the danger of communism, and they hoped that fascist countries would rid them of this danger. Japanese invasion of China. One of the first major acts of aggression after the First World War was the Japanese invasion of China in 1931. A minor incident involving a railway line owned by the Japanese in Manchuria was made the pretext for the invasion. China, a member of the League of Nations, appealed to the League for sanctions against Japan to stop the aggression. However, Britain and France, the leading countries in the League, were completely indifferent to the appeal and acquiesced in the aggression. Japan occupied Manchuria, installed a puppet government there and proceeded to conquer more areas. In 1933, Japan quit the League of Nations. Western countries thought that the Japanese could be used to weaken China as well as the Soviet Union. German remilitarization. Germany had been admitted to the League of Nations some time after its formation, but soon after Hitler came to power, he quit the League and undertook a massive program of militarization. According to the Treaty of Versailles, severe restrictions had been imposed on the military strength of Germany. Beginning of German remilitarization in violation of the treaty created a sense of insecurity in many countries, particularly France. It was in this situation that the Soviet Union became a member of the League in 1934. Germany remilitarized Rhineland and other areas, alarming the French. Nothing was done to stop this. Spanish Civil War. In 1931, Spain had become a republic. In 1936, a popular front comprising the socialist, communist, and other democratic and anti-fascist parties came to power. Section of the army under the leadership of General Francisco Franco with the armed support of Italy and Germany revolted against the government. Italy and Germany started intervening openly in the civil war that followed. Sent forces, tanks and warships in support of the rebels. German aircrafts conducted air raids on Spanish towns and villages. The government of the Spanish Republic appealed for help against the fascists. Only the Soviet Union came to the help of the Republican forces. Britain and France advocated a policy of non-intervention and refused to give any aid to the government of Spain. Remained indifferent to the German and Italian intervention in the war. Munich Pact. While the Spanish Civil War was still going on, Hitler's troops marched into Austria in March 1938 and occupied it. Even though this was a violation of the peace treaty signed after WW1, Western powers did not protest against it. The final act of appeasement of fascism by the Western powers was the Munich Pact. Germany coveted Czechoslovakia, which was very important because of its industries. Austria also had strategic importance for the expansion of Germany in the east towards the Soviet Union. Hitler claimed a part of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland, which had substantial German population. This area formed about 1/5 of the area of Czechoslovakia and had one of the largest munition factories in the world. Instead of meeting the threat posed by Germany, the leaders of Britain and France met Hitler and Mussolini at Munich in Germany in September 1938 and agreed to Germany's terms without the consent of Czechoslovakia. Soon after, the Sudetenland was occupied by German troops. Few months later, in March 1939, entire Czechoslovakia was occupied by Germany. Non-Aggression Pact. Soviet Union had been pleading for an alliance of Western powers with them. However, the Western policies of appeasement had convinced the Soviet Union that their main interest was to divert the German expansion towards the Soviet Union. Stalin proceeded to sign Non-Aggression Pact with Germany in August 1939, which guaranteed that the two countries would not attack each other. Signing this pact, Germany had protected itself from having to fight a two-front war in the soon-to-begin World War II. In return, as part of a secret addendum, the Soviet Union was to be awarded land, including parts of Poland and the Baltic states. The pact was broken when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union less than 2 years later in June 1941. Second World War. In spite of the fact that Western countries had agreed to all the aggressions of Japan, Italy and Germany, from the invasion of Manchuria to the annexation of Czechoslovakia, the fascist countries' ambitions had not been satisfied. These countries were planning another redivision of the world and thus had to come into conflict with the established imperialist powers. The Western policy of diverting the aggression of the fascist countries towards the Soviet Union had failed with the signing of the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. Danzig, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, had been made a free city independent of German control. Hitler had demanded the return of Danzig to Germany, but Britain had refused to accept this demand. 1 September 1939, German armies marched into Poland. 3 September, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the Second World War. German armies completed the conquest of Poland in less than 3 weeks as no aid reached Poland. In spite of the declaration of war, however, there was little actual fighting for many months. The war during this period from September 1939 to April 1940, when Germany invaded Norway and Denmark, is known as the Phoney War. The Soviet Union attacked eastern Poland. In 1940, the Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, which had become independent after WW1, were also occupied by the Soviet Union. Along with Moldavia, became republics of USSR. November 1939, the Soviet Union also went to war against Finland. Germany launched her invasion of Norway and Denmark on 9 April 1940 and within 3 weeks completed the conquest of these two countries. Norway, the German invaders were helped by Quisling, leader of Norway's fascist party, who set up a puppet government in Norway under German occupation. The very name Quisling has come to mean a traitor who collaborates with the invaders of his country. Early May began the invasion of Belgium and Holland, which was completed before the end of May. Soon the German armies marched into France, and by 14 June 1940, the capital city of Paris had fallen into German hands almost without a fight. Meantime, Italy also had joined the war on the side of her ally, Germany. 22 June 1940, the French government surrendered and signed a truce with Germany, according to which about half of France was occupied by Germany. The remaining part remained under the French government, which was required to disband the French army and provide for the maintenance of the German army in France. The French government, which had surrendered to Germany, ruled from Vichy. The defeat of France, Germany became the supreme power over the continent of Europe. The war conducted by Germany with great speed and force is known as Blitzkrieg. Britain was the only major power left in Europe after the fall of France. Germany thought that Britain would surrender soon, as she was without any allies in Europe. The German Air Force began bombing raids on Britain in August 1940 with the aim of terrorizing her into surrender. The battle that ensued is known as the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force of Britain played a heroic role in its defense against air raids and conducted air raids on German territories in retaliation. Under the leadership of Churchill, Britain successfully resisted the German air raids with courage and determination. Operation Barbarossa having conquered almost the entire Europe, except Britain, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, despite the Non-Aggression Pact, on 22 June 1941. Hitler had always coveted the vast territory and resources of the Soviet Union. He thought that the destruction of the Soviet Union would take about 8 weeks. Hitler had grossly underestimated the strength of the Soviet Union. In the first phase of the war with the Soviet Union, Germany achieved significant victories. Vast areas of the Soviet Union were devastated, Leningrad was besieged, and German troops were marching towards Moscow. However, in spite of the initial German successes, the German onslaught was halted. The Soviet Union had built up industrial and military strength and resisted the German invasion heroically, and the German hopes of a quick victory were thwarted. Soon after the invasion, Churchill and Roosevelt declared British and American support, respectively, to the Soviet Union in the war against Germany and promised aid to her. Pearl Harbor in September 1940, these three countries had signed another pact which bound them together even more. Japan recognized the leadership of Germany and Italy in the establishment of a new order in Europe, and Japan's leadership was recognized for establishing a new order in Asia. 7 December 1941, the Japanese, without a declaration of war, conducted a massive raid on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The American Pacific Fleet, which was stationed there, was devastated. Americans lost 20 warships and about 250 aircrafts. About 3,000 persons were killed. The attack on Pearl Harbor in the midst of negotiations with Americans showed that the Japanese were determined to conquer Asia and the Pacific. With this, the Second World War became truly global. USA declared war on Japan on 8 December 1941, and soon after Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Following the US entry into the war, many countries in the Americas joined the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japanese achieved significant victories in the war in Asia. Battle of Stalingrad in January 1940 to the unity of the countries fighting against the fascist powers was cemented. Representatives of 26 nations, including Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, signed a declaration known as the United Nations Declaration. Signatories to this declaration resolved to utilize all their resources to pursue the war until victory was achieved and to cooperate with one another against the common enemy, and promised not to have a separate peace treaty. November to December 1941, German advance on Moscow met with stubborn resistance, and the invasion was repulsed. Germany then launched an offensive in southern Russia. August 1942, the German troops reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Over 5 months, the battle raged. Involved about 2 million men, 2,000 tanks, and 2,000 airplanes. The civilian population of Stalingrad joined the soldiers in the defense of the city. February 1943. About 90,000 German officers and soldiers surrendered. German Afrika Korps was the expeditionary force that was sent to North Africa during World War II. It was first created as a holding force to back up the Italian defense of their African colonies. Afrika Korps fought in Africa, under various titles and commanders, from March 1941 until its surrender in May 1943. The Fascist alliance of Germany and Italy was ultimately driven from the land. After the campaign, the Allies would turn their attention to Italy, where they would win another crucial victory in the fight against militant fascism in Europe. Many sections in Italy had turned against Mussolini. He was arrested and a new government was formed. This government joined the war against Germany. However, German troops invaded northern Italy, and Mussolini, who had escaped with the help of Germans, headed a pro-German government there. Meanwhile, British and American troops entered Italy, and a long battle to throw the Germans out of Italy followed. Second front, Soviet Union was attaining significant victories against Germany and had already entered Czechoslovakia and Romania, which had been under German occupation. 6 June 1944, more than 100,000 British and American troops landed on the coast of Normandy in France, D-Day Operation Neptune. In September their number had reached 2 million. The opening of this front played a very crucial role in the defeat of Germany. This is known as the opening of the Second Front. Since 1942 in Europe, the most ferocious battles had been fought between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had been demanding the opening of the Second Front for long, as this would compel Germany to fight on other fronts also and would thus hasten the defeat of Germany. Of war after 6 June 1944, German armies had to face the forces of the Allies from 3 directions. Italy, the British and American troops were advancing. Northern and western France and the city of Paris had been freed, and the Allied troops were moving towards Belgium and Holland. The Eastern Front, the Germans were facing a collapse. Soviet army from the east and other Allied troops from the west were closing on Germany. In 1945 the Soviet armies entered Berlin. Hitler had committed suicide on the morning of the same day. 7th May 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered. End of all hostilities in Europe became effective from midnight of 9th May 1945. Nuclear bomb. After the defeat of Germany, the war in Asia continued for another 3 months. Britain and USA had launched successful operations against Japan in the Pacific and in the Philippines and Burma. In spite of serious reverses, however, the Japanese were still holding large parts of China. 6 August 1945, an atom bomb, the deadliest weapon developed during the war, was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. This was the first time that the atom bomb had been used. One single bomb, the city of Hiroshima was obliterated. Another atom bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki on 9 August 1945. The city was destroyed. Meantime, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and had started military operations against Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea. 14 August, Japan conveyed its acceptance of the Allied demand to surrender, but the actual surrender took place on 2 September 1945. The Japanese surrender, the WW2 came to an end. Destruction caused by the war in terms of human lives has no precedent in history. Over 50 million people perished in the Second World War. Them about 22 million were soldiers and over 28 million civilians. About 12 million people lost their lives in concentration camps or as a result of the terror unleashed by the fascists. Some countries lost a large percentage of their population. For example, Poland lost 6 million people, about 5 million of them civilians, which was about 20% of the Polish population. Soviet Union in absolute terms suffered the worst, about 20 million people, which was about 10% of the population. Germany lost over 6 million people, about 10% of her population. Besides the human losses, the economy and material resources of many countries were badly damaged. Many ancient cities were almost completely destroyed. Atomic bomb. Many new weapons of destruction were devised and used in the WW2. Most dreadful of these was the atom bomb. The atom bomb was first devised in the USA. Scientists of many countries, including those who had come to USA to escape the fascist tyranny in Europe, had helped in developing it. Project Manhattan to develop the bomb was taken up when a number of scientists, including Einstein and Oppenheimer, suspecting that the Nazi Germany was developing the atom bomb, approached the US government. They had feared that if the Nazis developed the bomb, they would use it to terrorize the world into submission. The atom bomb was first tested in July 1945. By then, Germany had already surrendered. Many of those who had helped in its development appealed to the US government not to use it against Japan, against whom the war was still continuing. Also warned of the danger of starting a race in the production of atomic weapons if the atom bomb was used against Japan. However, the President Truman used the atom bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima, Little Boy, and Nagasaki, Fat Man. These two bombs killed over 320,000 people almost instantaneously and completely wiped out large parts of the two cities. Effects of these bombs on the health of those who survived and on their children continue to this day. USA justified the use of the atom bomb on the ground that it brought WW2 immediately to a close and thus helped to save human lives which would have been lost if the war had continued. Many other people, including the scientists who had helped in making the bomb, condemned its use. Holocaust was a systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. Holocaust is a word of Greek origin meaning sacrifice by fire. Nazis, who came to power in Germany in January 1933, believed that Germans were racially superior and that the Jews, deemed inferior, were an alien threat to the so-called German racial community. Although Jews, whom the Nazis deemed a priority danger to Germany, were the primary victims of Nazi racism, other victims included some 200,000 Roma, Gypsies. At least 200,000 mentally or physically disabled patients, mainly Germans, living in institutional settings, were murdered in the so-called euthanasia program. To concentrate and monitor the Jewish population as well as to facilitate later deportation of the Jews, the Germans and their collaborators created ghettos, transit camps, and forced labor camps for Jews during the war years. German authorities also established numerous forced labor camps, both in the so-called Greater German Reach and in German-occupied territory, for non-Jews whose labor the Germans sought to exploit. Steps to Death Stage 1 Exclusion. Nuremberg Laws of Citizenship of September 1935, marriages BW Jews and Germans were forbidden, boycott of Jewish business. Stage 2 Ghettoization, all Jews to wear Yellow Star of David and surrender all their wealth and sent to a ghetto. Stage 3 Annihilation. Final solution: mass killings within minutes with scientific precision. Post-war years. The world has been completely transformed during the years since end of WW2. Political map has also changed. Influence and the dominations which a few European imperialist powers exercised in the pre-war years became things of the past. A large number of nations in Asia and Africa emerged as independent nations. The Soviet Union also emerged as a mighty power, in spite of the terrible devastation it suffered during the war. The danger of a new world war which would destroy human life altogether created a new awareness of the need for establishing lasting peace. Peoples and nations made efforts in this direction by promoting mutual relations based on friendship and cooperation. Also created many new institutions and agencies for the purpose. However, in spite of these efforts, the period after WW2 has been full of conflicts and wars in which hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, even though the world has escaped a large-scale conflagration. WW2 Immediate consequences. During the war, the major Allied nations had held many conferences and had issued declarations stating the principles which would form the basis of peace. First major declaration had been issued by Britain and USA in 1941, which stated that they would not seek any territory. Also supported the right of every people to have the form of government of their choice. In 1942 was issued the United Nations Declaration. This declaration supported the one issued by Britain and USA earlier. Another declaration stated that all the Chinese territories taken by Japan would be restored to her. 1943, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, leaders of Britain, USA and the Soviet Union, respectively, met at Tehran. Yalta Conference early in 1945, when Germany was on the verge of defeat, the heads of the three big nations met at Yalta in the Soviet Union. Germany to be split into 4 zones and Germany to pay reparations. Government of national unity to be set up in Poland comprising of both communists and non-communists. Free elections in countries of Eastern Europe. Declaration of Liberated Europe. Russia to help against Japan upon Germany's defeat. United Nations subsequently, a conference was held at San Francisco, USA, from 25th April 1945. The conference was attended by 50 nations. 26 June the conference adopted the United Nations Charter under which a new world organization was set up. This was the United Nations organization which was based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states. Potsdam Conference BW Britain, USA and the Soviet Union was held at Potsdam, near Berlin, from 17th July to 2nd August 1945. Declaration issued by this conference mentioned the main aims of the Allies with regard to Germany which had already surrendered. Germany had been partitioned into 4 zones, each under the control of Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Objective to bring about the complete disarmament of Germany, to destroy the Nazi Party, and to prepare conditions for the creation of a democratic Germany. It was also decided to set up an international tribunal to bring to trial persons who had committed crimes against humanity. Decisions were also taken regarding the border between Poland and Germany, and the transfer of the northern part of East Prussia to the Soviet Union and the southern part to Poland. America had tested atomic bomb by then, and informed Attlee and Stalin of the same. Rise of communism in Europe. Communist parties and other anti-fascist parties in these countries had played an important role in the struggle against German occupation of these countries. By the end of 1948, the governments of all these countries were dominated by the communist parties. Albania and Yugoslavia, the struggle against German occupation had been led by the communist parties of these countries. These countries' 2 communist parties formed the governments. To WW2, Soviet Union was the only country ruled by communists. Now a large number of European countries were ruled by communist parties. The political parties were either not allowed to exist or had only a nominal presence. Within the communist parties themselves, differences over policies were not allowed and the power within the communist parties became concentrated in a few hands. As in the Soviet Union, dissent even within the ruling parties was not tolerated and many veteran communists were shot or sentenced to long periods of imprisonment. Germany, the 4 powers, Britain, France, USA and the Soviet Union, which were in occupation of 4 different zones of Germany, followed different policies in dealing with the social, economic and political problems in their respective zones. British, French and American zones, the economic development continued on capitalist lines. 2 major parties in these zones were the Christian Democratic Party and the Social Democratic Party. 1948, Britain, France and the United States decided to merge the 3 zones under their control, which were in West Germany, and form a separate state of West Germany called the Federal Republic of Germany with its capital at Bonn. East Germany, which was under Soviet occupation, the policies pursued were different from those that had been followed in the Western zones. Lands were distributed among peasants and all the major industries were taken over from private hands and made the property of the state. 1946 the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party in the Soviet zone of Germany merged to form the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. October 1949, the Soviet zone became a separate state called the German Democratic Republic. The division of Germany had been a source of tension in Europe and a major factor in the Cold War. East Berlin was the capital of East Germany, while West Berlin, which was located within the GDR territory, was treated as a part of West Germany. 1961, the GDR authorities built a wall between East and West Berlin to prevent East Germans from going away to West Berlin. The building of the wall became a further source of tension in Europe. The process of ending communist rule in GDR and of the reunification of Germany began in 1989 when the Berlin Wall was pulled down and political parties, which were outside the control of Socialist Unity Party, were allowed to function. Early 1990 elections were held and a new government came to power. 3 October 1990, the division of Germany was ended and a unified Germany again emerged. In Britain, the elections were held in July 1945. The Conservative Party, whose leader was Winston Churchill during the war, lost and the Labour Party came to power. Many important industries such as coal mines and railways were nationalised. Steps were taken to provide social security to the people and to build a welfare state in Britain. However, period after the Second World War saw the rapid decline of their empires as process of decolonization had begun. Eastern Europe in 1956, 3 years after the death of Stalin, the Communist Party of Soviet Union had denounced the excesses and crimes committed by Stalin. In 1985, many important reforms began to be introduced in the political system of the Soviet Union with a view to promoting political democracy. There was free and open discussion on every issue and curbs on the freedom of thought and expression were lifted. Perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were the key pillars of reforms sought to be introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Meantime, there was a demand for greater autonomy by the republics which constituted the Soviet Union. Some republics wanted to become independent. Attempts were made to frame a new treaty which would provide greater autonomy to the republics and at the same time preserve the Union. However, in August 1991, there was an attempt to stage a coup by some leaders of the Communist Party. Though the coup collapsed, the Soviet Union began to break up. Many republics declared their independence. 25 December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the president of the Soviet Union during this period and had initiated the reforms mentioned earlier, resigned and the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. The rule of the communist parties has ended in all these republics. Many of them are faced with serious political and economic problems. 12 of them have formed a loose federation called Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. Warsaw Pact 1955, the military alliance which was headed by the Soviet Union and of which the communist-ruled states of Europe were members, was dissolved in 1991. Established as a counterweight to NATO, but no direct confrontation between them. Instead, the conflict was fought on an ideological basis and in proxy wars. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact led to the expansion of military forces and their integration into the respective blocs. The collapse of the Soviet Union has also been seen as marking the retreat of socialism. It can, however, be said that the system which was built in these countries was only a distorted version of the socialist ideal, and that social justice, which was fundamental to that ideal, has become a part of the consciousness of the people the world over. Breakup of Yugoslavia. After the Allied victory in World War II, Yugoslavia was set up as a federation of 6 republics, with borders drawn along ethnic and historical lines: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Slovenia. In addition, two autonomous provinces were established within Serbia, Vojvodina and Kosovo. Each of the republics had its own branch of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia party and a ruling elite, and any tensions were solved on the federal level. Yugoslav model of state organization, as well as a middle way between planned and liberal economy, had been a relative success, and the country experienced a period of strong economic growth and relative political stability up to the 1980s under the rule of President for life Josip Broz Tito. After his death in 1980, the weakened system of federal government was left unable to cope with rising economic and political challenges. The breakup of Yugoslavia occurred as a result of a series of political upheavals and conflicts during the early 1990s. After a period of political crisis in the 1980s, constituent republics of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia split apart, but the unsolved issues caused bitter interethnic Yugoslav wars. Wars primarily affected Bosnia and Herzegovina and neighboring parts of Croatia. War antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union and the armed confrontation between the military blocs headed by them. Since the end WW1, USA had emerged as the strongest power in the world. After WW2, her power had grown still more compared with the European powers who had dominated the world for centuries. This was both in the spheres of economic and military strength. After it acquired the atom bomb, the awareness of her power was further strengthened. The Soviet Union had suffered more than any other country in the war. Besides the 20 million people it lost during the war, hundreds of her towns and thousands of factories had been completely destroyed. However, in spite of these losses, Soviet power and prestige had increased. This was to some extent due to the very important role it had played in defeating Germany. Since the revolution, she had been ostracized and boycotted and had faced the open hostility of the other big powers. However, after the war, a number of countries in Europe, as has already been mentioned, were ruled by communist parties. The Soviet Union exercised a lot of influence over the governments of these countries. As a result of these developments, the isolation of the Soviet Union had come to an end. During the war, Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union had together fought against the fascist countries. Many declarations issued during the war had emphasized that the unity among these countries would continue after the war also and would be the basis of a durable peace and international brotherhood. These declarations had aroused hopes all over the world. However, the war was hardly over when conflicts and tensions began to emerge between Britain and the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. Relations between them began to deteriorate and came to be characterized by what has been called the Cold War. Gradually, the Cold War became more and more intense and the world was divided into two major blocs, USA and West European countries forming one bloc and the Soviet Union and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe forming the other. The most important reason for the outbreak of the Cold War was the Western countries' fear of communism. The increase in the might of the Soviet Union, the emergence of governments ruled by communist parties in Eastern and Central Europe and the growing strength of communist parties in many parts of the world alarmed the governments of the United States, Britain and other West European countries. In 1949, the victory of the Communist Party of China in the Civil War, which had been dragging there for about 2 decades, added to the alarm. The United States openly declared that her policy was to prevent the spread of communism. One of the objectives of the massive economic aid that the United States gave to West European countries was also to contain communism. The USA began to look upon every development in the world from this standpoint, whether it promoted or helped in checking communism. Britain and West European countries became aligned with the United States and began to follow a policy mainly aimed at curbing the growth of communism. This had many adverse consequences for democracy and freedom movements in the colonies. Freedom movements in many countries began to be considered unsympathetically by countries which were not themselves colonial powers but were aligned to the colonial powers. Growing tension in the world was worsened by the setting up of military blocs. NATO in 1949, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed for defense against the Soviet Union. Members of this alliance were the United States, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Portugal, Britain, France, Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg. Greece, the Federal Republic of Germany and Spain became its members later. NATO Army was created which established its bases in many countries of Europe. Similar military alliances were set up by the United States and Britain in other parts of the world. SEATO in 1954 Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, was set up with the United States, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines and Pakistan as members. Baghdad Pact in 1955 The Baghdad Pact was brought into being. Consisted of Britain, Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan and Iran. USA established its military bases all over the world for use against what she considered the danger of communist aggression. Formation of these alliances and the establishment of military bases worsened the already tense international situation. Some countries which were members of these alliances were very unpopular. For example, when there was a revolution in Iraq in 1958, that country withdrew from the Baghdad Pact, which had been named after capital of Iraq. The name of Baghdad Pact was then changed to the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO. These alliances were generally unpopular in the countries of Asia and Africa as all the imperialist powers of Europe were members of these alliances and used it to suppress the movements for freedom. Most of the countries of Asia and Africa which had won their freedom refused to join these alliances. Warsaw Pact 1955 to 1991 Soviet Union and the socialist countries of Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and the German Democratic Republic formed the Warsaw Pact. Under this pact, the Soviet Union stationed her troops in these countries. However, the Soviet Union and the other members of the Warsaw Pact did not have any military bases in other parts of the world. The Soviet Union had treaties of friendship and mutual assistance with China. The arms race formation of the military alliances was accompanied by another dangerous development. This was the race for deadlier weapons of destruction. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atom bomb. Few years later, nuclear weapons which were thousands of times more destructive than the atom bombs used against Japan were developed. These were the thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs. Testing alone of these bombs created serious hazards to life. Many movements were launched in all parts of the world to demand a ban on the testing and manufacture of nuclear weapons. However, the arsenals of nuclear weapons in the world went on increasing. Along with the nuclear weapons and many other kinds of weaponry, new bombers, submarines, and missiles have been developed which can carry these weapons over thousands of kilometers. Major Cold War events. 1962 crisis, the Soviets deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. Striking range of Florida. President John F. Kennedy responds with a naval blockade of Cuba, and the two sides are at the brink of nuclear war. After a 13-day standoff, Soviets removed the missiles. 1979 ARGHN invasion. Soviet troops invade Afghanistan in support of the Marxist government, which won 1960-1975 Vietnam War in 1965. US sends combat troops to aid South Vietnam in its war against Communist North Vietnam, which is supported by the Soviets and the Chinese. By the time US troops leave in 1973.58,000 Americans have died. War ends in 1975 when Communist forces overrun the South. 1985 Mikhail Gorbachev becomes leader of the Soviet Union. Grasping his nation's dire lead Sektcom atom reform lose over introd demo troop refer SOI after Reger East. 1970s and early 1980s some beginnings were made to end the Cold War. Agreements were reached between the United States and the Soviet Union to eliminate some categories of carriers of nuclear weapons and to reduce the number of certain types of weapons installed in certain areas. The process of ending the Cold War, however, suffered many setbacks. For example, Afghanistan. In 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan. This development increased the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. Star Wars. United States launched a program of developing new and even more deadly weapons. Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as the Star Wars. These weapons would have meant taking the conflict into outer space and launching attacks from there. Throughout the 1980s as the Soviet Union fought an increasingly frustrating war in Afghanistan. At the same time, the Soviet economy faced the continuously escalating costs of the arms race. Sent at home grew while the stagnant economy faltered under the combined burden. Attempted reforms at home left the Soviet Union unwilling to rebuff challenges to its control in Eastern Europe. During 1989 and 1990, the Berlin Wall came down, borders opened, and free elections ousted communist regimes everywhere in Eastern Europe. Late 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved into its component republics. Stunning speed, the Iron Curtain was lifted and the Cold War came to an end. On alignment, many newly independent nations of Asia and Africa as well as many nations in other continents did not like the military blocs. Began to follow a policy of non-alignment with any military bloc. Emergence played a very important role in reducing the intensity of the Cold War and in creating an atmosphere of peace. Crucial role in promoting non-alignment and peace was played by India after her independence. Emergence of the countries of Asia and Africa as independent nations marked a new phase in the history of the world. These countries which had been suppressed and kept under subjugation for a long time came to their own and began to play an important role in the world. Similar developments have also taken place in Central and South America and the Caribbean. Countries which were under European colonial rule in this part of the world had become independent. The United States frequently interfered in the internal affairs of these countries, particularly when radical governments came to power and tried to assert their political and economic independence. In 1955, an important event took place which helped to strengthen the unity of African and Asian countries. This was the Afro-Asian Conference, which was held at Bandung in Indonesia. The conference was attended by 23 Asian and 6 African countries. Leaders of 3 Asian nations, India, China and Indonesia, played an important role in the deliberations of this conference. The conference adopted a declaration on promotion of world peace and cooperation, which included Nehru's 5 principles and a collective pledge to remain neutral in the Cold War. The growing importance of the Afro-Asian countries was reflected in the United Nations, where on a number of issues the countries of Asia and Africa functioned as a group. Most of the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa refused to join the Cold War. Considered the formation of military blocs as a serious danger to peace and to their independence. These countries were faced with the enormous task of social and economic reconstruction, which could be done only in a world free from war and tension. Some countries in Asia had joined the military alliances and had allowed foreign bases to be set up on their soil. Extension of military alliances and the setting up of foreign bases were considered by most Asian countries as a threat to their independence and a source of tension. Hence they opposed these alliances. Non-aligned nations of Asia and Africa, therefore, were in the forefront of the struggle for the liquidation of colonialism. Non-alignment has primarily been a policy aiming at the strengthening of independence, ending of colonialism, and promoting world peace. It was not merely a policy of non-involvement with military blocs but a policy for creating a better world. The first summit conference of non-aligned nations was held at Belgrade in Yugoslavia in September 1961 under Josip Broz Tito. It was attended by heads of state or government of 25 countries. Besides Yugoslavia and Cuba, other participating countries were from Asia and Africa. 3 other countries attended as observers. Beginning with 25 countries which attended the Belgrade Conference in 1961, there are today 109 countries which are following the policy of non-alignment. Movements of national liberation, the Palestine Liberation Organization and Southwest Africa People's Organization, were made full-fledged member states of the non-aligned movement. India hosted 7th Summit in Delhi under Indira Gandhi in 1983. Decolonization countries in Africa and Asia had long and sometimes bitter struggle against colonial rule. Generally, colonial powers were not willing to give up their hold on the colonies and left only when they found that it was not possible to maintain their rule anymore. Imperialism as a whole had been weakened as a result of the war. Economies of many imperialist countries had suffered. Forces, communist and socialist parties, within the imperialist countries, which were friendly with the people struggling for independence, also had grown powerful. Freedom and democracy were the major aims for which the Allies had fought against the fascist countries, and these aims had been made the basis for arousing peoples all over the world against fascism. Fulfillment of these aims could no longer be confined only to Europe. Many colonies which fascist countries had occupied by ousting the older colonial powers, the freedom movements had played an important role in the struggle against fascist occupation. Japanese occupation in Asia. Another major international factor which facilitated the end of imperialism was the emergence of the Soviet Union and other socialist countries as a major force. These countries were inimical to imperialism and often gave aid and support to the freedom movements in the colonies. Freedom movement in one country supported the freedom movements in other countries. The role of countries which had achieved their independence was very crucial in this regard. These countries supported the cause of those peoples who were still under colonial rule at the United Nations and other international forums. Besides the movements in the colonies for independence, there were also movements in Asian and African countries to oust outdated political systems, to modernize the social and economic systems, and to assume control over the resources of one's country which had remained under foreign control even after freedom. Burma achieved her independence from Britain a few months after India became independent. In 1944, the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, AFPFL, had been formed in Burma. The aim was to resist the Japanese invasion of Burma and to win independence for Burma. After the war, the British tried to restore their rule over Burma. This led to the intensification of the movement for freedom. In the course of the struggle, many leaders of the Burmese freedom movement were assassinated. However, Britain was forced to agree to the demand for freedom and Burma became independent on 4th January 1948. Indonesia. After the defeat of Japan, Sukarno, one of the pioneers of the freedom movement in Indonesia, proclaimed the independence of Indonesia. However, soon after the British troops landed there in order to help the Dutch to restore their rule. The government of independent Indonesia, which had been formed by Sukarno, resisted the attempt to re-establish colonial rule. There were demands in many countries of the world to put an end to the war which had been started in Indonesia to restore the Dutch rule. In Asian countries, the reaction was particularly intense. Leaders of the Indian freedom movement demanded that Indian soldiers, who had been sent to Indonesia as a part of the British Army, should be withdrawn. After India became free, she convened the Conference of Asian Nations in support of Indonesia's independence. The conference met in New Delhi in January 1949 and called for the complete independence of Indonesia. The resistance of the Indonesian people and the mounting pressure of world opinion and Asian countries compelled Holland to set the leaders of Indonesian people free. On 2 November 1949, Holland recognized the independence of Indonesia. Sri Lanka. Mainly as a consequence of the militant freedom struggle in India, that the less militant Sri Lanka won its independence. It was initiated around the turn of the 20th century and led mostly by the educated middle class. It remained Dominion until 1972. Ireland. Ireland was the only country in Southeast Asia which was not colonized by Europeans. All of its neighbors were controlled by either the British or the French. Burma and Malaysia being British colonies, and Laos and Cambodia being French. Served as buffer between French Indochina and British Empire, and partly due to reforms and modernization carried by Rama IV and Rama V. Under the monarchy, Thai foreign policy welcomed both the British in Burma and the French in Vietnam, which neutralized two long-standing threats to Thai security and hegemony. Signed Berne Treaty agreeing to establish a uniform taxation system, to reduce taxes on foreign trade and to abolish some of the royal monopolies. Increased in trade, thus kingdom became wealthier and army better equipped. Philippines unilaterally declared independence from Spain in 1898 under leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, culminating the 1896 revolution. Unbeknownst to newly established government and the Filipino people in general, USA had secretly arranged to purchase the colony along with several other possessions from Spain through the Treaty of Paris. The 1920 as the peaceful efforts by the Filipino leadership to pursue independence proved convincing. The Democrats returned to power. In 1933, they worked with Filipino to plan a smooth transition to independence. It was scheduled for 1946. Asia. China. After the Japanese invasion of China, the two parties and their armies cooperated for some time to resist the Japanese aggression. However, the conflicts between the two never ceased. Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek was a party which mainly represented the interests of capitalists and landlords. The Communist Party, on the other hand, was a party of workers and peasants. The areas under Communist Party's control, the estates of landlords had been expropriated and the land distributed among the peasants. Because of the policies pursued by the Communist Party, it gradually had won over millions of Chinese people to its side. The Communist Party had also organized a huge army called the People's Liberation Army, PLA. After the defeat of Japan and the driving out of the Japanese forces from China, the Civil War again broke out. The government of the United States gave massive aid to Chiang Kai-shek, but by 1949 his armies were completely routed. The remnants of his troops, Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, Formosa, an island which had been occupied by Japan after she had defeated China in 1895. On 1 October 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed and the Communist Party of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong came to power. The establishment of the People's Republic of China was a defeat for USA. Refused to recognize the government of China for over 2 decades till 1971. After Japan's defeat in the Second World War, Korea was divided into two zones, the northern zone under Soviet occupation and the southern zone under American occupation, to bring about the surrender of Japanese troops. The plan was to make Korea an independent state. However, as in the case of Germany in Europe, two different governments in Korea were formed in 1948. Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, under the leadership of Korean Communists, Kim Il-sung. South Republic of Korea, South Korea, by a group of parties under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. He was an anti-communist and wanted an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek to prevent the spread of communism. Both the states organized their armies and there were frequent clashes between them. In 1948, the Soviet troops withdrew from Korea followed by the American troops who withdrew in 1949. Both the governments of Korea favored unification of the country, but there was no meeting ground between them. June 1950 war broke out between North and South Korea. Chinese Revolution had already taken place and USA feared further expansion of communism in this area. USA sent troops to support South Korea in the war. These troops fought as the troops of the United Nations because UNSC had passed a resolution condemning North Korea and had asked members of the UN to aid South Korea. Armistice was signed in 1953. Korea remained divided into two separate states. Differences emerged between North Korea and the Soviet Union, central among them Kim Il-sung's philosophy of Juche, which focused on Korean nationalism and self-reliance. Despite this, the country received funds, subsidies, and aid from the USSR and the Eastern Bloc until the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. Vietnam. After the French government surrendered to Germany, many parts of Indochina were occupied by Japan. The movement for the freedom of Indochina from French rule had started many years earlier. The greatest leader of the people of Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. He had been engaged in organizing the communist and the nationalist movements in Vietnam since soon after the end of WW1. Vietnamese people under Ho Chi Minh's leadership resisted the Japanese occupation and organized a people's army called the Viet Minh. By the time the Second World War ended, the Viet Minh controlled a large part of Vietnam. In August 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was proclaimed with Ho Chi Minh as president. However, the British troops as well as the troops of Chiang Kai-shek arrived in Vietnam in the pretext of completing the surrender of Japanese troops there. October 1945, the French troops also arrived with the aim of restoring French rule. In 1946, the French army started fighting against the Viet Minh. Also set up a government with Bao Dal, who had headed the puppet government under Japan earlier, as the ruler. War between the Viet Minh and France continued for 8 years. In 1954, the French forces suffered a severe blow at the hands of Viet Minh at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. French defeat at Dien Bien Phu has become famous because a people's army without any sophisticated defeated the army of a powerful imperialist country. The debacle at Dien Bien Phu compelled the French government to start negotiations with the government of Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In July 1954, an international conference was held at Geneva. It was agreed to partition Vietnam temporarily into North and South Vietnam and to hold elections all over Vietnam within 2 years to unify the country under a single government. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, with the partition of Vietnam, another phase in the freedom movement in Vietnam began. The government that was established in South Vietnam, with USA support, refused to abide by the decisions of the Geneva Conference with regard to the holding of elections and the unification of Vietnam. It came to be increasingly regarded as being under the control of the United States, which was opposed to the unification of Vietnam under the leadership of the Communist Party. In early 1960s, uprisings broke out in South Vietnam against the government there. This was a Cold War-era proxy war. This was followed by the massive American military intervention in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of American troops were sent there with some of the most advanced weaponry to suppress the popular uprising. The war continued for a number of years. South Vietnamese people led by the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong, carried on guerrilla warfare. Had the support of North Vietnam, conventional warfare. American troops carried the war into North Vietnam. Calculable damage was done to Vietnam as a result of the heavy bombings by American forces. Gulf of Tonkin incident 1964 involved either one or two separate confrontations involving North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American report blamed North Vietnam for both incidents, but it eventually became evident that their claim about the incident was false, and deliberately so. To passage of Gulf of Tonkin resolution which gave US President authority to assist any say Asian government facing communist aggression. The offensive was one of the largest military campaigns of the war in 1968 by North Vietnam against South Vietnam. Campaign of surprise attacks against military and civilian command and control centers throughout South Vietnam. The offensive failed in its goal of overthrowing the South Vietnamese government, but became the turning point in the war, as it persuaded a large segment of the US population that its government's claims of progress toward winning the war were illusory despite many years of massive US military aid to South Vietnam. Opposition to the war grew in USA itself on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of Americans refused to be drafted in the US Army and many American soldiers deserted. No other single issue had united millions of people all over the world as the war in Vietnam. However, America continued the war even though it was clear they could not win it. In 1975, the war took a decisive turn. Armies of North Vietnam and of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam swept across the country routing the American-supported troops of the government of South Vietnam. January 1973, the American troops had begun to withdraw from Vietnam. During the war in Vietnam, 58,000 of them had lost their lives. 30th April 1975, all the American troops had withdrawn and the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, was liberated. North and South Vietnam were formally united as one country in 1976. Cambodia War in Vietnam had also spread to Cambodia in 1970. The government of Prince Sihanouk was overthrown and a pro-USA military-led Khmer Republic was established. Troops of the USA and South Vietnam had carried the war to Cambodia on the ground that the Vietnamese were receiving their supplies from bases in Cambodia. By the time the United States withdrew from the war in 1975, a party which called itself Khmer Rouge, Communist Party backed by North Vietnam, Viet Cong, China, had taken control of Cambodia under the leadership of Pol Pot. The government of Pol Pot established a regime of terror in Cambodia and started following a policy of genocide against its own people. The Khmer Rouge regime was highly autocratic, xenophobic, paranoid, and repressive. Genocide was under the guise of the Khmer Rouge enforcing its social engineering policies. Attempts at agricultural reform led to widespread famine, while its insistence on absolute self-sufficiency, even in the supply of medicine, led to the death of thousands from treatable diseases such as malaria. Part of the purification included numerous genocides of Cambodian minorities. Estimates of people murdered by the Khmer Rouge vary from 1 to 3 million, 25% of population. 1979, Pol Pot's government was overthrown with the help of Vietnamese troops. However, the war in Cambodia continued as the Khmer Rouge still had some areas under its control inside the country. Meantime, three groups, including the Khmer Rouge and the group led by Norodom Sihanouk, came together in opposition to the government in Cambodia, which was supported by Vietnam. East Asia and Africa. Syria and Lebanon. After the war, the French tried to restore their authority over Syria and Lebanon, but, in the face of opposition from the people of these countries and the world opinion, they were forced to withdraw. Both Syria and Lebanon became independent by the end of 1946. League EST 1945. There was an upsurge in all the Arab countries at this time, and the 1950s saw their emergence as independent nations. Some countries which had been nominally free asserted their independence. There were also movements to overthrow the outdated political systems which existed in some countries. These led to conflicts and, in some cases, prolonged wars between the Arab countries and the imperialist powers. The period saw the growing power of Arab nationalism, which led to efforts by the Arab people and governments to come together to face and solve common problems. The Arab League was formed, comprising all the Arab states. Israel-Palestine issue. Palestine had become a British mandate in 1919 after WW1. British troops again occupied the country in 1945. Palestine was inhabited by Arabs and Jews. A movement called the Zionist movement claimed that Palestine was the homeland of all the Jews, wherever they may be living, and should be restored to them. The persecution which the Jews in Europe had suffered for centuries had culminated in the Nazi Germany's policy of exterminating them. Millions of Jews were killed in Germany and countries occupied by Germany. Terrible tragedy had won them the sympathy and support of the world. British in Palestine had permitted some Jews from outside Palestine to settle there. Zionists had, meanwhile, been campaigning for a Jewish state there. This had complicated the freedom movement in Palestine, the majority of whose inhabitants were Arabs. In 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution according to which Palestine was to be divided into an Arab state and a Jewish state. However, in 1948, the British withdrew their troops from Palestine, and soon after the State of Israel was proclaimed. This led to a war between the Arab states and Israel. Arab states were defeated in the war. The creation of Israel became a source of tension in West Asia. Arab states refused to recognize her as a legitimate state. Policies pursued by the government of Israel further added to the bitterness. About 900,000 Arabs were forced to leave their homes and lands in Palestine and were rendered homeless. They found shelter in various refugee camps in Arab states. Since World War II, the US has vowed to achieve two main foreign policy objectives in the Middle East: control the region and its resources, and prop up its allies, often dictators, while maintaining a degree of stability so that the US is able to conduct its business unhindered. Most countries of Asia and Africa condemned the Israeli government's treatment of the Arabs of Palestine and for following racist policies. In 1956, Israel joined Britain and France in invading Egypt to reopen Straits of Tiran. In spite of the resolutions of the United Nations, Israel refused to vacate Arab territories and restore the rights of the Palestinian Arabs, many of whom live as refugees in various Arab states. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) was formed to fight for the establishment of a Palestinian state. It enjoys the status of a member state of the Non-Aligned Movement. Later there were other wars: Six-Day War in 1967, between Israel and the Arab states, as a result of which Israel occupied large parts of the territories of other Arab states. These territories include the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights and the West Bank. Israeli morale and international prestige were greatly increased by the outcome of the war, and the area under Israeli control tripled. Arab world had experienced humiliation in the lopsided rout of the Egyptian-Syrian-Jordanian alliance in the Six-Day War but felt psychologically vindicated by early successes in Yom Kippur War. War led Israel to recognize that, despite impressive operational and tactical achievements on the battlefield, there was no guarantee that they would always dominate the Arab states militarily, as they had consistently through the earlier First Arab-Israeli War, the Suez War, and the Six-Day War. These changes paved the way for the subsequent peace process. 1978 Camp David Accords that followed led to the return of the Sinai to Egypt and normalized relations, the first peaceful recognition of Israel by an Arab country. To Egypt being booted out of Arab League and assassination of Anwar Sadat. Africa after WW1. Only change that took place there was the transfer of former German colonies in Africa to victorious Allied powers. However, the period after WW1 saw a resurgence of nationalist movements in Africa. After WW2, the disintegration of the colonial rule in Africa began. Countries of southern Africa began to gain their independence after the mid-1950s. Into decades, almost every country in Africa, with the exception of South Africa and Southwest Africa, Namibia, became independent. Freedom movements in Africa, as in other parts of the world, were the consequence of the growth of nationalism and the increasing resentment against the exploitation and oppression by the colonial countries. WW2 had resulted in the general weakening of imperialism. Had also shattered the myth of the invincibility of some major colonial powers in Africa such as France and Belgium, which had suffered defeat in Europe during the war. The collapse of colonialism in Asia within a few years after the war also had a tremendous impact on freedom movements in Africa. Egypt after WW1, Egypt had become a British mandate. However, under the pressure of the nationalist movement, Egypt had been declared independent in 1922, though British troops continued to remain there. After WW2, the demand for the withdrawal of British troops gained strength. There were serious clashes between the Egyptians and the British soldiers in which hundreds of Egyptians were killed. Content was also directed against the King of Egypt who had been installed by the British. This led to a revolution in 1952 when the Egyptian army under leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser and Muhammad Naguib overthrew the monarchy and declared Egypt a republic. The Egyptian government demanded the withdrawal of British troops, and they were withdrawn in June 1956. The new government of Egypt refused to be aligned with the United States, and the latter stopped the sale of arms to Egypt. Egypt, however, began to receive military and economic aid from the Soviet Union. In 1956, Egypt announced the nationalization to the Suez Canal, which had been under the control of Britain and France. 3 months later, Israel, Britain and France, according to a plan, invaded Egypt. Aggression committed against Egypt led to worldwide protests. Countries of Asia voiced their vehement condemnation of the invasion. There were massive protest demonstrations against the British government inside Britain also. The Soviet Union warned the aggressor countries that unless they withdrew from Egypt, it would send its forces to crush the aggressors. Everyone denounced Britain, France and Israel in the United Nations. Universal condemnation of aggression led to the withdrawal of British and French forces from Egypt. Ending of aggression strengthened further the unity of Asian and African countries in general and of Arab countries in particular. America threatened Britain's financial system by selling pound bonds of USA government. This crisis signified the end of Great Britain's role as one of the world's major powers. Libya had come under Italian rule in 1911. During WW II, some of the most ferocious battles between German and British troops were fought in Libya. At the end of the war, the country was occupied by Britain and France. In 1951, Libya became independent, with a monarchical form of government. In 1960, became one of the largest petroleum-producing countries in the world, and as a result some sections of Libyan society grew very rich while the majority of the population remained extremely backward. The king did not permit any opposition to his rule. USA built one of its strongest air bases on Libyan territory. In 1969, a group of army officers led by Muammar Gaddafi captured power and soon after abolished the monarchy. Ejected both the Italian population and Western military bases from Libya while strengthening ties to Arab nationalist governments. Gaddafi transformed Libya into a new socialist state called a Jamahiriya, state of the masses, in 1977. Officially adopted a symbolic role in governance, but remained head of both the military and the revolutionary committees responsible for policing and suppressing dissent. Algeria-1950s saw the emergence of a number of independent nations in North Africa. However, the independence was preceded by years of struggle against the imperialist countries, which wanted to retain their colonial possessions. In Indochina, the French returned to Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. However, in 1956 Tunisia and Morocco won their independence. Algeria had to wage the longest and the hardest battle for freedom. In 1954 the nationalist organization called the FLN, National Liberation Front, gave a call for an armed struggle against the French rule. Armed clashes resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. In 1958, the Algerian nationalists had organized a large army of their own and proclaimed the formation of a government of the Republic of Algeria. War in Algeria had serious consequences inside France. Created political instability in France. The Communist Party of France along with many other French leaders had been supporting the cause of Algerian independence. However, many sections in the French army were under the influence of the French settlers in Algeria who were opposed to any negotiations with the Algeria. In 1958, Charles de Gaulle became the President of France. He conceded the right of the Algerian people to self-determination and open negotiations with the leaders of the FLN. This policy was opposed by some sections of the French army in Algeria, who revolted against de Gaulle and even made attempts to assassinate him. However, the revolt was suppressed. On 1 July 1962, a referendum was held in Algeria and the people of Algeria voted almost unanimously for independence. Gold Coast Ghana, first country in Western Africa to gain independence, was Ghana. The Kingdom of Ghana was powerful during 8th to 12th centuries. The British had conquered a part of this region to which they gave the name Gold Coast. The most prominent leader of the people of the Gold Coast colony was Kwame Nkrumah, who in 1949 had organized the Convention People's Party. Strong trade union movement had also emerged in Gold Coast. Convention People's Party and the trade unions joined together to demand independence from Britain. However, most of their leaders were arrested and attempts were made to suppress the demand for freedom. After 1950, the British government started introducing certain constitutional reforms. Under pressure from the People's Party, which had won a resounding victory in elections, the British government agreed to the independence of Gold Coast. New independent state which came into being on 6 March 1957 called itself Ghana. The next country to achieve her independence was the French colony of Guinea in West Africa. 1958, while embroiled in the war in Algeria, France held a referendum in her colonies which had been grouped together as French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. People of Guinea voted for complete independence, and Guinea was proclaimed a republic. Achievement of independence by Ghana and Guinea gave additional confidence to the freedom movements in other parts of Africa and accelerated the pace of achievement of independence by other nations. 1960 is generally regarded as the Africa Year. That year, 17 countries in Africa gained their independence. These included all the French colonies in French West Africa and Equatorial Africa, Nigeria and Congo, formerly Belgian Congo, now called Zaire. Between 1961 and 1964, a number of countries in East and Central Africa also became independent. These were Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Zanzibar, Nyasaland, Northern Rhodesia, Rwanda and Burundi. Sierra Leone, Gambia, Lesotho, formerly Basutoland, and Botswana, formerly Bechuanaland, also gained their independence. The Kenya freedom movement in Kenya was led by Jomo Kenyatta, leader of the Kenya African Union. In 1952, a revolt by peasants had broken out. This is known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. It was directed against the seizure of land by the British colonial authorities. To suppress the rebellion, 15,000 Kenyans were killed and about 80,000 sent to concentration camps. Jomo Kenyatta was imprisoned in 1953 on the charge of supporting the Mau Mau Rebellion. The Mau Mau movement remained internally divided, despite attempts to unify the factions. Having failed to suppress the freedom movement, Britain had to give in and Kenya became independent in 1963. Portuguese colonies before the end of the 1960s almost entire Africa, with the exception of Portuguese colonies of Angola, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands, and South Africa, Southwest Africa and Rhodesia, had become free. Powerful freedom movements had started in the Portuguese colonies. They had organized their liberation forces and had secured the help of many countries in their struggle for freedom. In April 1974, the Portuguese army, which had been mainly used to suppress the freedom struggles in the colonies, overthrew the 50-year-old dictatorship of Antonio Salazar in Portugal with the support of the people. Communists, socialists and other radical elements in the armed forces and the new government of Portugal were opposed to the continuation of the Portuguese rule in Africa. Entered into negotiations with the freedom movements in the Portuguese colonies, and by 1975 all the former Portuguese colonies in Africa became independent. Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, became independent in April 1980. South Africa and apartheid. South Africa, Union of South Africa since 1910 and Republic of South Africa since 1961, has been an independent country in the sense that she was not ruled from another country. The government of South Africa was, however, among the most oppressive regimes in the world in the 20th century. It was under the exclusive control of the white minority practicing the worst form of racism. Under the system of apartheid established in South Africa, all people were classified and separated on the basis of race. Each group had to live in a separate area. There were separate schools and universities, separate theaters, separate shopping centers, separate coaches in trains for whites and blacks and others. Teams for sports also were formed on the basis of race. Marriage between persons belonging to different races was a criminal offense. There were restrictions on movement from one place to another. Best lands in the country were under the control of the whites who had all the economic and political power. Non-whites had no vote and no say in the governance of the country. The system of apartheid was used to maintain the rule of the white minority over about 80% of the population, which comprised black and colored people as well as people of Indian origin. The system, in the name of separation of the races, denied human rights to the majority of the population. The organization of the South African people, which led the movement for ending the rule of the white minority and establishing a non-racist democratic South Africa, was the African National Congress, ANC, set up in 1910. The movement against the obnoxious system of apartheid was intensified in the 1950s. The government depended on the use of terror to maintain its rule. There were incidents of massacres of peaceful protesters such as Sharpeville. In 1960, the African National Congress was banned and most of its leaders were arrested. At the end of the 1980 as the process of ending the system of apartheid began. This was due to wide isolation policy followed by other countries against South Africa. The ban on the African National Congress was lifted and its leaders released. Among them was Nelson Mandela, who had been in prison for 26 years and had become a symbol of the struggle against apartheid. Many apartheid laws were abolished and negotiations were started between the ANC and the South African government, F.W. de Klerk, for framing a new constitution which would give all South Africans the right to vote. Elections in which all South Africans for the first time were given the right to vote was held in April 1994. After these elections, a new non-racist and democratic government came to power in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was elected president of the country. Namibia, last country in Africa to become independent, was Namibia, formerly South West Africa. It was a German colony before the First World War and was handed over to South Africa as a mandate after the defeat of Germany in that war. South Africa treated South West Africa as her colony and refused to withdraw from there despite of the resolutions of the United Nations. The freedom movement there was led by the South West Africa People's Organization, SWAPO, which was formed in 1960. Gained momentum when SWAPO started a war with the help of its guerrilla forces to liberate the country. It was made a member of the Non-Aligned Movement. Non-aligned movement, the African governments and the United Nations played an important role in the success of the freedom movement in Namibia. War in Namibia came to an end in 1989 when South Africa agreed to a plan for the independence of the country. Zimbabwe. 1880 as European colonists arrived with Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, SACC, obtained a concession for mining rights from local king of Ndebele people. Named Southern Rhodesia in 1898 and annexed as a self-governing British colony in 1923. 1965, Zimbabwe became autonomous and was led by a white segregationist government after Ian Smith, who made a unilateral declaration of independence, UDI, from Britain. This was after the British government had made majority rule a condition for the independence of Rhodesia from Britain. Zimbabwe War of Liberation or Rhodesian Bush War Civil War from 1964 to 1979. Conflict pitted three forces against one another: Rhodesian government, led by Ian Smith, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, and Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union. Republic of Southern Rhodesia was replaced by Zimbabwe Rhodesia after Abel Muzorewa won the first majority elections. Lacking international recognition, after about 3 months, the country was taken back into the hands of Britain, as per the Lancaster House Agreement, which was meant to facilitate transition. The country once again became a British colony known as Southern Rhodesia. In the April 1980 elections, Robert Mugabe, head of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, won the majority and became the Prime Minister.